Now, it seems a new study there has found that babies exposed to 2 languages show better learning, better memory than those exposed to just 1 language.
Now, the study involved 114 6-month-old infants, about half of who were exposed to 2 languages from the time they were born. Now, the research was done by A-Star and 2 hospitals and is believed to be the first of its kind. Sharon C. with more.
Whether the babies were hearing English and Mandarin, English and Malay, or English and Tamil, researchers found one thing in common among them. Bilingual babies got bored of familiar images faster than monolingual babies and stared for longer periods of time at the novel image. Researchers said past studies have shown that babies who rapidly get bored with a familiar image demonstrated higher cognition and language ability later on. They said a preference for novelty is also linked with higher IQs and better scores in vocabulary tests. Researchers say this is the youngest age at which bilingual advantage has been shown.
Parents of young babies often second-guess early bilingual exposure, because babies seem to be quite limited in their language abilities to our eyes, and so we wonder sometimes if they'll get confused by having 2 languages. So this research shows us that they may benefit from having 2 languages early in life, and we know from other research that the infants don't actually get confused.
The children were first tested in 2011 when they were 6 months old, and they will continue to be tested until they turn 9. But in Singapore, even babies who are from monolingual families don't stay monolingual for too long. More than half of the 54 babies from the control group of monolinguals had also become bilingual when they turned 2. At some point, the control group of monolingual children will fall below a critical mass and become too small. But by then, they will be old enough to take standardized tests, and Prof. Leher says they can then be compared to monolingual children from other countries like the US. As for those children who became bilingual between 6 and 18 months, the team also hopes to compare them with the first group who were bilingual from birth, to see if gaining a second language earlier gives them any advantage.
And to tell us more, we have with us the lead author of the study, Associate Professor Leher Singh from the Department of Psychology at NUS, and another of the authors, Dr. Anne Rifkin-Graboy from the Singapore Institute for Clinical Sciences at A-Star.
Ladies, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Prof. Singh, let me start with you. Tell us more about this study. What motivated it? How did it begin?
Well, we've known for some time that in children and adults there's a distinct advantage associated with bilingualism. So we've known for some time there are cognitive benefits to speaking 2 languages for several years or several decades. And what motivated this study was to look at whether the bilingual advantage is much earlier to emerge than we originally thought, and whether we can observe it before a child produces their first word or their first sentence.
Dr. Anne, in terms of better learning and memory skills, I mean, what other interesting observations did you actually make?
Right, so this study was part of a larger cohort study called Growing Up in Singapore Towards Healthy Outcomes. And within that, we're really interested in all kinds of factors that influence brain development. So in partnership, A-Star, KK Hospital, NUHS, and of course NUS, we've examined a lot of different factors, things like maternal anxiety, maternal depression, parenting behavior, breastfeeding, diabetic pregnancies, things that are important within the Singaporean context, but also on a global scale. And a lot of these things we're starting to find do influence the brain development and cognitive functioning of things similar to the kind of tests that Leher had starting as early as 6 months of age.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, for babies at that young age, I mean, they always say you should expose, the young kids to a lot of things because they just absorb like a sponge. I mean, similarly with this, were you able to, or how far on has the study gone to what age of the children? Will there be a subsequent follow-up perhaps in their later years when they are older to see how that has actually developed in time?
Right. So, very glad you asked. We're actually seeing kids now between the ages of 3.5, because they were recruited over a long period of time, between the ages of 3.5 to 4.5 years of age. We're even seeing kids at 48 months in something called a school readiness test to try to get a handle on where maybe as a predictor of school performance. And we're launching a new cohort study called SPRESTO to look at mothers even before they conceive, and we'll be able to, relevant to this study, do things like look at language exposure during pregnancy and perhaps how it affects the development of the brain at birth. So there are lots of plans for follow-up and for parallel studies.
So the results of those comparative studies will actually be very beneficial. But along with this, there are certain myths, aren't there, about that are linked perhaps with raising a bilingual child, such as speech delays and confusion, etc., depending on the language. How can parents actually overcome these myths?
I think the best thing parents can do is look at the science. So science shows us that children don't get confused, and I think the most compelling study that I know of was published a few years ago from University of British Columbia, showing that babies whose mothers spoke 2 languages in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, within a few hours of birth, can tell these languages apart. So if a newborn baby can differentiate their 2 languages, that's a very strong starting position for multiple language acquisition. But it's true that bilingual children do show confusion. They do show speech errors the same way that monolingual children show speech errors. But the confusion and the errors are usually transient and they self-correct, whereas the benefits are enduring and observable across the lifespan.
Does this apply to all children? Are we speaking across the board, whether regardless of race or where they're from or background? I mean, how's it?
Do you mean, do they show speech errors?
Sorry, I mean in terms of, when this study was done, the children development, does it apply to all children across the board?
Very comforting thing about this study, the bilingual advantage was observable in equal measure across English Malay, English Chinese, and English Tamil babies. So it's something that doesn't seem to be dependent on a particular language pairing, but it's robust across different language groups.
Were we able to see, because they always say consistency, one parent needs to be the one always speaking English, for example, and always speaking Mandarin, and if they switch, does that then perhaps add to that myth about the confusion and the...
There isn't much hard evidence on what mixing does for a bilingual child. And I think Singapore is an ideal place to look at these issues. And as the sample moves more towards a multilingual sample, the opportunity for subtyping in that way will be present.
Okay. So maybe in future we can look beyond a bilingual, trilingual, and because we've got all the dialects and sometimes a bit of this and that, which I guess can add to the color of it. Well, ladies, thank you so much for coming in and speaking to us this evening. Professor Singh there from the Department of Psychology at NUS and Dr. Ann from the Singapore Institute for Clinical Sciences at A*STAR.